Greetings, dear listener. Subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new scary stories and support me with a like. Enjoy listening.
Hi all, my cousin told me this story. She and her family lived in a small village near Akhtubinsk. Her father was a truck driver, Uncle Sarek. In general, this incident occurred in July 1996. Sarek was returning from another flight in his Kamaz from the KYZ horde. The path is not close, about 1,000 kilometers through the desert. At 3 o'clock in the morning he had 200 kilometers to go home when suddenly he saw the silhouette of a voting man on the highway. He slowed down and turned on the high-beam headlights and saw an attractive girl in a long white dress. He stopped in front of her. She opened the door and asked for a ride to the nearest village. He agreed and they set off. The girl looked at him with some obvious interest. He asked her what she was doing late at night by the road and so far from civilization, but she just smiled and remained silent. This behavior seemed strange to him. Well, he's silent. I thought I'll make the music louder. When he reached for the radio, his gaze accidentally fell on her feet. Instead of feet, there were hooves. Goosebumps ran across his skin, but he didn't show it. He slowly stopped and asked her to see if the rear tires on her side were flat. She smiled and left. As soon as the cab door slammed shut, he pressed the pedal all the way and rushed on. About 15 minutes passed. He was already far from the place where he dropped her off. Having calmed down a little, I slowed down. And then suddenly I saw a hand reaching down from above the windshield. Next came the head of this girl with black bottomless eyes. She looked into his eyes from the roof. He experienced all the horror of this look, squinting. He grabbed the steering wheel tightly and pressed on the gas again. Closer to 5 o'clock in the morning, he drove up to the village without letting go of the steering wheel. It was getting light outside. Having already arrived in the village, he saw that she was no longer in the window. Arriving at the house, he ran out of the car and looked around. There was no one on the roof. He came home, went to the wash basin, looked in the mirror, and saw that there was no black hair left on his head. It was as if he had aged 30 years. Overnight he turned gray and covered with wrinkles. In the morning I told my wife everything about what happened. He did not survive the next night. He was found in the morning, lying in the corridor with his mouth wide open and eyes of complete horror. It was getting dark and the fog was falling. Tired truck driver Jakiand and wanted to talk to someone. Second day on the road and not a word from anyone. Suddenly, on the side of the road, he noticed a man in overalls and a tank helmet. The driver stopped and opened the door in a friendly manner. "Bro, can you share some diesel fuel?" asked the tanker. "What?" The ensign stole everything from the unit. Henry asked jokingly, "We have no time for laughter now, brother. Help out better than your comrades. The enemy is nearby." What enemy? Do you have any training? Well, okay, I served myself. I know that we need to help each other out. The driver, smiling, took out 2 cans and handed them to the tanker. "Hold it, Commander." "Thank you, brother. The motherland will not forget you." The driver did not want to let the tanker go so quickly and started a long conversation with him. They managed to discuss a lot, but the commander, looking at his watch, briefly said, "I have the honor," and went into the forest. The driver drove on. Driving across the steppe, he saw something strange. Maybe it was a picture from the past. Maybe he was already asleep at the wheel, and this was a dream. Or maybe he was imagining all this. But a 34 was circling in the field, shooting at a self-propelled gun. Suddenly the T-34 tank stopped and after 3 minutes caught fire. Then there was a knock on the door. The driver lowered the window, looked at the knocker and was numb with horror. The same tank driver was standing on the road, only burned to the bones, looking him straight in the eyes and saying, "Man, is there any diesel?" There was nothing further. Jake stepped on the gas and ran away from this damned place. All the way in front of him he could see the face of a tanker asking for diesel fuel. When the driver returned home, he told this story, and the older men told him that in August 1942, the only tank that remained on the battlefield, our D-34, with all its might, held the Germans in one village in Ukraine. The crew successfully destroyed 2 medium tanks, 1 self-propelled gun, and 4 anti-tank guns. When it became quiet on the battlefield, the driver said, "Brothers, there are no diesel engines. We need to refuel, otherwise we won't go anywhere." The commander nodded approvingly and handed the driver 2 cans. Before they had time to open the canister, the commander, looking through binoculars, shouted, "Tiger, let's get to our places. Let's escape with the remains of the solarium." And as soon as the tank turned around, it immediately received an accurate shot at the engine and caught fire. In just 5 minutes, the tank turned into a steel coffin for the crew. The fire to call 4 guys. And since then, the crew has been asking single people passing by for solarium and showing them what happened to them. My uncle, who worked as a truck driver all his life, like any person whose profession involves traveling, always kept in his bosom several dozen interesting tales that you listen to with your mouth open. Therefore, each of our meetings began with my request to tell me something unusual or funny, so that I could then tell it to my friends. Almost every story of his was so memorable or unusual that among my friends I quickly became a favorite storyteller, which couldn't help but make me happy. The story below, told by me from his words, is not one of the humorous or tricky stories, but I do not doubt its authenticity for one interesting reason. The point is not only in trust in relation to the uncle, but in the fact that after returning from the business trip in which this story happened, the uncle was baptized and since then never took off his Orthodox cross, regularly observed all fasts, and visited the temple every now and then, especially before each new flight. The following is the story itself from the uncle's words. I usually go on flights with my partner, Enriuka. Somehow this has happened since I joined this company, to which I gave no less than 15 years. As you know, I love my job, and this is also good company. Enriuka is a noble joker and a master of telling all sorts of stories, even the most boring ones, so that you wanted to listen to him without stopping. In general, he entertained me while I was turning the wheel. This is probably what gave birth to such a strong friendship that we were able to carry through the years. That business trip was not unusual and was no different from most of our flights. We also began our journey, taking turns until one of us needed to sleep or just relax. It was not even 5 in the morning when we set out. By that time, winter had already fully declared its rights with a blizzard, frost, and of course, a stunning snow-white view opening through the windshield of the cabin. Coffee in a thermos, pleasant music on the radio, a car starting to pick up speed, and a white canvas before your eyes. Beauty. Everything went exactly the same as usual. We stopped periodically for a snack, shared problems, and discussed current affairs, asking each other for advice. The events themselves took place approximately on the 3rd day of the voyage. When tired and hungry, we drove up to the place where we were supposed to have a snack and rest a little. However, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, half an hour passed, and the place was still not visible even on the horizon. Having double-checked the correctness of the route several times, we were both pretty surprised there were no deviations from the road. After 2 or 3 hours, we were angry as hell. As luck would have it, we didn't even have the minimum set for a snack, since we were going to stock up on food in that very place. I don't know how much more time passed when a small light appeared to us in the distance. At first they thought that they were imagining things out of hunger. However, we drove closer and closer, and the light from the light seemed more and more real, and soon it acquired the very clear outline of a window in a small house where the light was burning. Enriuka and I looked at each other, and, without saying a word out loud, we turned off the Trix engine. Both stared as if spellbound in the direction of the hut, either trying to read each other's thoughts or something else. And somehow we decided to knock among ourselves and find out if there would be any food for us, whether it was a matter of severe hunger or something else. However, none of us felt absolutely any embarrassment about the fact that we were actually going to knock on someone else's house to ask for food. It's not that we consider this something shameful, but neither Enriuka nor I had to do this before. But we didn't know when we would be able to eat now, and driving on an empty stomach is fraught with various consequences, such as dizziness or even fainting. Getting out of the car, we headed to the house, noting along the way that despite the strangeness of its location at such a distance from any populated areas, it looked quite well groomed and tidy, and the light in the window seemed to symbolize home warmth and comfort. We knocked awkwardly and waited for an answer. A minute later, the owner of the house appeared before us. She turned out to be a lonely old woman, barely moving her legs, who, smiling a toothless smile, invited us to come into the house. We did not delay and, struggling with awkwardness, explained the essence of our problem, to which the woman agreed. As you can see, I live alone, the old woman said sadly, walking towards the kitchen. From morning to evening, she said, I don't often have guests, but I just cook cabbage soup. I don't need much myself. It's already old. I will treat travelers. I will gladly treat them. From her words, we, as if numb, could not utter a word. We just sat down at the table in silence, waiting for the old thrifty woman to place cups of hot, steaming food in front of them. The cabbage soup turned out to be extremely tasty and rich. Aunt Ryuka and I ate so hard that our ears were cracking. We have never tasted such delicious food. Meanwhile, the old woman sat opposite, without asking any questions, and simply smiled, looking at us. Having finished eating, we put the plates away from us and stared first at each other, and then at the old woman, who did not stop smiling ingratiatingly. Thank you very much. Aunt Ryuka began, but stopped short, as if he had forgotten what he was actually going to thank the helpful and kind woman for. Why thank me? Thank you for visiting me. I really miss being here alone, even though I have a lot to do. Sometimes you start busy around the house, but you don't notice how the day has passed. It's time to go to bed, and if I need to go to the forest, then I won't be able to return home for a couple of days, or even more. The healing herb is blooming now. Oh, it's useful. This does not grow anywhere else, but it remains in these places. That's why I live here, in such a wilderness. We sat and listened to the old woman's story with great attention and interest. Warmth spread inside us and our bodies slowly became heavier. I was already looking with a lazy gaze at the woman, who still did not stop talking about her life and the peculiarities of life in these places. The next moment, the old woman invited us to stay the night, saying that it was already late and where would we go in the dark? And there seems to be no need, because there is an opportunity to sleep not on an uncomfortable bunk inside the truck, but on a completely warm and soft bed. Aunt Ryuka, as a less impressionable person, at first decided to object, saying that it was inconvenient, and so they had the audacity to ask for a table with a stranger. So the road awaits. The cargo must be delivered on time. What nonsense. Grandma almost laughed. Rest for an hour or two and then hit the road again. Who will hold you? Will nothing happen in a couple of hours? Having said this, the woman led us into a clean, neatly decorated room with 2 beds made with fresh, crisp sheets, and wishing us good night, closed the door behind her on the other side. Without thinking twice, we looked at each other and began to undress. Having taken off everything except our underwear, we lay down on the soft sheets, which from fatigue and a hearty dinner seemed like lush clouds to us rather than a bed, covered ourselves with a warm duvet, and instantly fell into a deep sleep. I don't know what Enryuka saw and whether he dreamed of anything that night. However, my dream seemed very strange. I ran through the forest in amazement, looking for my comrade, screaming and calling him. Despite all this, I never remembered what I was doing there or how I ended up in the first place. Suddenly a snowstorm began. I experienced a wild cold. I began to shiver, and, as luck would have it, my clothes were too light for such weather. In the end, I was overcome by a terrible cough. I literally began to choke, and, apparently, this helped me wake up. Sharply opening my eyes, I hovered for a couple of moments, trying to comprehend what was happening and remember at least something. To my great horror, the first thing I saw in front of me was my friend Enryuka, who was lying with me in the snow in only his underwear. His skin was already completely white, and from the thought that my friend was no longer alive, I completely woke up. Jumping to my feet, I tried to push Enryuka, but this was extremely difficult to do. He continued to sleep as if nothing had happened, as if he did not experience any discomfort at all. Panic overcame me. As in the dream, the blizzard roared with might and main, sweeping up huge flakes of snow and chilling me to the very bones. It was almost impossible to look around to see anything. Not far away, I could barely see the outline of a truck, and even then I wasn't sure about it. When visibility began to restore, an even more unpleasant surprise awaited me. 200 meters away from us stood a silhouette, which with every moment acquired more and more clear outlines. Old woman, the same one who the day before received us as the most dear guests and treated us to a delicious dinner, stood looking at us and smiling. Oh no, this was not the smile with which the old woman greeted the two hungry travelers. It was a real grin, and a little later, through the whistling wind, I managed to hear a terrifying, sinister laugh. The woman was not dressed in the old but neat clothes that she had worn in the evening. There was no trace of a kitchen apron. The old woman was wearing old rags with brown spots, which exposed her thin, withered legs, causing not only wild horror, but also disgust. The toothless mouth, which the creature opened wide, let out a deafening scream, as if warning that it was approaching. "You will die! You will die! You will die!" The creature roared in rage, clearly annoyed that I had to wake up and not freeze like a stray dog in the snow. In horror, I began to pull Enryuka's hand, while shouting some kind of nonsense that I wouldn't remember even at gunpoint. For some time he continued to be unconscious, and I was already thinking about how quickly I could drag him to the car, even if he was dead. After all, I definitely wasn't going to leave him in the clutches of this monster. Fortunately, my worst fears were not confirmed, and I managed to bring Enryuka to his senses. I have never seen such stunned eyes on him before, and I hope that I will never see him again. Without explaining anything, I began to lift him by the hand, after which we both grabbed our things, which lay in neat piles next to us, all covered in snow, and quickly walked towards the car. Having climbed inside, I sat my friend on the bed, literally throwing blankets at him, and, jumping behind the steering wheel, I hit the gas. Only after driving a few kilometers did I decide to stop to properly rethink the situation and at least try to understand who or what we had just almost become a victim of. Enryuka was completely out of his mind at the word. He was still shaking from the cold, even though the heater was on full blast. On the contrary, I was too hot. Most likely it was the temperature, but I had neither the strength, nor the desire, nor the opportunity to think about it in this situation. I sat down next to Enryuka and tried to find out if he saw anything after he woke up. But Enry was lucky. He saw nothing, unlike me, before whose eyes there was still a picture of an unknown creature, laughing and squealing with rage, approaching us. I had to tell my friend about all this, and then we would realize it together. And there was something to realize. In fact, there was no hut, and certainly no friendly hostess who supposedly fed us the most delicious dinner of our lives. There were no warm beds with crispy clean sheets, and no warm welcome at all. There was only a lawn covered with snow, on which two old comrades almost fell asleep forever. Later, we tried to make inquiries about this place and found out that we were far from the first who happened to see a strange house in this place in the middle of many kilometers of deserted road. Only one part of the people passed by, and the other part will never be able to say anything about this situation again. After this incident, it took me a long time to come to my senses. I took a vacation without explaining anything to anyone. At first I wanted to go somewhere, spend time alone on the seashore or rent a house in the mountains, but at the last moment I changed my mind. As soon as I imagined that that creature could find me when I was alone and, moreover, unarmed. Therefore, I stayed at home all the time, with the lights and TV always on, even when I was sleeping. And if I had to get out of the house, I did it exclusively during the daytime, when there were people around. After all, who knows where this creature is hiding? I have been working as a driver for a long time, and in my entire long life I have seen a lot. But after what I saw on that flight, I began to pray before each flight. Not so long ago I was just jumping behind the wheel, not thinking about anything, and I didn't even have time to think about some kind of prayer. But what happened to me completely changed my whole life. This is my worst truck driver story. Let me tell you right away that I never even thought about something unknown, and in general, the supernatural was beyond my understanding. But it so happened that I accidentally, not of my own free will, became the object of an incredible incident. This happened when my path lay through Altai. The full moon illuminated the starry sky. The night was so bright that all neighboring territories were clearly visible. I want to emphasize the fact that I was never afraid even on dark nights, because my truck has excellent low and high beam headlights. That night I was worried about only one thing, that I had been driving for the third day, and a couple of cans of energy drinks that I had drunk since the evening had already begun to lose their ground. I just wanted to sleep like crazy. The same thoughts constantly appeared in my head. that there was just a little left, and I would soon be there and go to bed, and the next morning I would go to the sauna and drink beer and fish. But one thing bothered me, as it seemed at first, a trifle. For 3 hours, I did not meet a single car on my way. There was no oncoming traffic, no hitchhiking. Just as I remember now, I convinced myself that it was night outside and many people were sleeping either at home or in roadside hotels. He turned on the radio and with his peripheral vision noticed that something incomprehensible flashed in the mirror. Having lowered the window, I looked out and was very scared. A creature that looked a little like a dog was running a couple of meters from my car. But if we take into account the size, it was much larger than an ordinary dog. This creature was simply huge, larger than a horse. In addition, the creature was moving next to the car at a speed of 60 kilometers per hour. It was incredible. I had the idea that I had fallen asleep at the wheel, but realizing that I was not sleeping, I pressed the gas pedal. The speed increased by another 20 kilometers per hour, but the creature did not lag behind and still moved next to my truck. Adrenaline began to rush through my blood. I couldn't believe that this was actually happening. A black dog of extraordinary size, which has fantastic speed, runs next to a truck, which is rushing at breathtaking speed. Can this even happen? Soon what I expected happened. Around the corner. The light of the town where I needed to go became visible. The small town that at that moment I wanted to see more than anything in the world. But I began to rejoice early, as it turned out, very early. Then something happened that simply put me in a state of shock. This creature approached the cab of the truck and was now moving only a meter away from me. In horror, I raised the side window and pressed the gas further, but it was already clear that speed was not a problem for this creature. A chill ran through my body when this terrible creature turned its head in my direction. I realized that it saw, in full view, all of me, saw my fears. I saw huge, bottomless eyes, which clearly belonged to a completely intelligent creature, aware and understanding of everything, knowing a lot. Even when the speed became more than 100 kilometers per hour, this beast still ran next to my truck. It only lagged behind when I passed a road sign indicating that the city begins next. Having entered the city, I stopped my truck near a convenience store. Falling out of the cab with a cigarette in my teeth, I tried to put my thoughts in order, to understand what I had seen just a couple of minutes ago. In the end, I chalked it all up to my fatigue. After all, this simply could not happen. It's time to rest. I'm already imagining something that is not and never was, and cannot exist at all. Having finished smoking a cigarette and thinking that it was time to go to a psychiatrist, I went into a store where I saw a pretty sales girl. She stood and smiled without making any movements. Then I realized that there was no one in the store except her, not even the security guard. But the girl stood and did not move. And then another revelation came to me. I didn't hear anything when I pushed the door. Nothing at all. It didn't make any sound. My body began to tremble again. I stood in one place and looked around hauntedly. And then, as if something had switched, I heard the voice of a girl asking if I was feeling okay. Almost immediately, drunken teenagers burst into the store to buy more, and a security guard appeared from the back room. A little later, a few more people came into the store, and then I realized that I was fine. I still don't fully understand what happened to me, but I realized one thing. When a person simply collapses and has no strength, he is on the edge of the world. As soon as I got to bed, I immediately fell into it like a sack, and in the morning I realized that last night I had been in the next world with one foot. Something saved my life and helped me reach my destination without incident. Now I think that the creature that looked like a dog was a messenger of death, who was just waiting for me to make a mistake and fall to death because I was in such a state that this could happen at any moment. My uncle worked as a truck driver for many years. A mystical and rather scary story once happened in the life of his partner. James often brought moths into his truck, and that time everything was as usual. I dropped the girl off and then dropped her off on the highway at the first stop that came along. It was winter, late at night. The nearest settlement was very far away, so it was impossible to reach on foot. Probably that girl didn't wait for the bus and froze to death. In the morning she was discovered by passing cars. The girl's friends knew which person she was with and which direction she was going, and therefore, first of all, they attacked Dennis, but he managed to fight back. lying that he didn't see or know anything, and that he dropped the girl off in the city and didn't have the slightest idea about her further fate. After the funeral, everything calmed down. But in the summer, James unexpectedly got into a terrible accident at the bus stop where the same girl died. The car was wrecked, the goods being transported were damaged, and the man ended up in the hospital with a terrible head injury and broken bones in the spine and legs. After 14 days, he came out of his coma. The cause of the accident, in his words, was that the girl was crossing the road, and so he had to turn sharply. But a few witnesses claimed that there were no obstacles to James' transport. My uncle's colleagues talked to James, and he claimed that it was the girl who was giving a lift who crossed the road. The truck driver also added that she comes to him every night and sits next to the bed on a chair. He says that she was not buried in a Christian manner, and that he still owes her money. Then the man was transferred to a mental center, and a year later he came out as disabled. No one knows about his future fate, except that he often visits his former colleagues and asks them to take him to that terrible place. Having arrived there, he wanders for hours and doesn't know what he is looking for. The girl probably worries James to this day. My colleague told me about a year in 1997, and he was told by a direct participant in the events. It all happened around 1990 plus. Two men pooled their money to buy a KAMAZ truck. At that time, the opportunity to own a truck had just become available and began to transport all sorts of cargo on it. And they came across an order to deliver something to Stepanakert, or, on the contrary, to pick up something from there. In general, they had to drive a few more kilometers when their KAMAZ was stopped by some people in civilian clothes, but with firearms. The driver jumped to the ground. These people surrounded him and started asking him something in non-Russian. He told them that he didn't understand. Then they asked him something again. He again said that he didn't understand. And what happened? Should I give you a ride or what? Then they switched to Russian and asked what nationality he was. He replied that he was Russian, from Kuban. In response, they told him that he was dark-haired, with a black mustache and brown eyes. Not very much. In general, he looked like a Russian. Show me, dear man, his passport. He showed that it said something like Sergei Petrovich Kovalenko, Russian nationality. People in civilian clothes began to energetically discuss something among themselves in their own language, arguing. Then they came to some kind of unified decision, after which they told Sergei Petrovich, okay, go. Sergei Petrovich got behind the wheel of the KAMAZ and drove off. Suddenly his partner sees him sitting white as chalk and shaking him all over. He can't even get a cigarette out of the pack. His hands are shaking so much, but it must be said that although he, unlike his partner Seryoga, was brown-haired and looked more like a Russian than the Kuban Cossack Seryoga, he was precisely a representative of one of the nationalities that lived around Stepanakert, and they already lived in a very non-peaceful manner. Seryoga asks his partner, "What are you doing?" Seryoga, "Don't you understand what happened?" "What happened?" "They probably wanted us to give them a lift, but it turned out to be out of the way." "No, Seryoga, at first they thought that you were not their nationality, and when it turned out that you were Russian, one of them said that they needed a KAMAZ. Big deal, 2 more corpses. And another said that he had a friend in the army from Kuban. Maybe it was his neighbor or acquaintance. We'll find another KAMAZ for ourselves, so let them go.